Okay, so yeah, I'm talking about the hopeful future of various OpenGL related interfaces on Linux. I'm going to start by talking about where we are now, where we want to go, and then some ideas about how we might be able to get there. So right now we have an ABI that was set down in 2000 that defines libgl, which that single library includes all of GLX up to 1.3, OpenGL 1.2, and ARB multi-texture. So raise your hand if you can think of any useful program that still only uses that set of interfaces. And no, GLX gears does not count. Put your hand down, Keith. Oh, okay. So, okay. Now, I bet that uses some other extensions. Yeah, maybe. All right. So in addition to that, we have libegl, which just has the EGL interfaces, and we have two separate libraries for the different versions of OpenGL+ES. These aren't really defined by the Linux ABI, but they are defined by some implementer recommendation documents from Khronos. So this has a whole big variety of problems. If you have an application that wants to use more than OpenGL 1.2, what do? Well, you have to jump through some hoops, and it's kind of a hassle. What if you want to use GLES with GLX? Well, that's an even bigger hassle, it turns out. And likewise, if you want to use desktop OpenGL with EGL, and, oh god, indirect rendering. Yes, it involves chemicals and fire, yes. So the biggest problem with indirect rendering is that we're required to support it and have it be available as part of the interface, but it's just completely fail. The performance of it is awful. It only supports up to OpenGL 1.4, 1.5 if you're really strong. The vertex buffer extensions, there is a spec for the protocol. Once upon a time, I implemented most of it and then gave up and went to Drinking Island. There are some legit use cases for indirect rendering, but me and Andy are probably the only two people in the room who can identify any of those use cases. And the number of applications that want them are minuscule. So what happens instead is sometimes apps accidentally get that, and we get bug reports of, oh, hey, I tried to run such and such game and it quit because it only got OpenGL 1.4. What the hell? I've got a brand new card. So it just leads to rage and fail. So where do we want to go? So one, we need to get GLX and desktop GL separated. There was a really, really nice proposal, and I'll have a link to it at the end of the slides, by Andy for splitting this. Basically put the OpenGL interface parts in its own library, maybe called libOpenGL or something, kind of the same way that GLES is split out, and then put the GLX parts in its own library in kind of the same way that EGL is split out. So then you can do the sorts of mixing and matching that applications might want to do. If you want to use GLES with GLX, you can do that in a really straightforward way by just linking with the right libraries. If you want to use desktop GL with EGL, it's likewise pretty straightforward. We'll have to keep some sort of a libgl around that sort of glues those two libraries together so that existing binary applications will continue to work. One question mark about this is about versioning the library and trying to get away from at least some of the get proc address madness. Most apps have either use some sort of a library or have some sort of code that they've rolled themselves to go around and get proc address 47 million functions. Yeah, so that's the question is, should we use ELF library versioning? Should we put the name, or the version in the name, kind of like they do with GLES? there's some pros and cons to either approach, and I don't really have an answer. That's
so the one problem with the problem with using the SO name is that the application at link time wants to specify the version of OpenGL they want, and so they do.
Yeah.
And so then you get the SO name of whatever -L lib OpenGL points to.
Yeah, you can do that.
Is there?
Yeah. Yeah,
What is that?
That you can specify that you want a specific major version of the library.
On the linker command line?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Dash, okay, I'd be interested to see.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So and that makes it so that a lib OpenGL.so.3 would be compatible with a libgl so.3.1, which is kind of one of the problems is that if we want to if we want to produce a new one of these libraries every time there's a new OpenGL version, so that, say in a year OpenGL 4.4 comes out and we want to make a library that has all those symbols available, we can't just use the major number because there's multiple GL4s, and so maybe it's not obvious how we version this thing and communicate that to app developers. So it's a discussion topic. The other question related to this is if we can bump the minimum GL version. Right now, implementations are required to support at least OpenGL 1.2, which is so old as to be useless at this point for anything that anyone's trying to do. But we do still see people submitting bugs occasionally on like R200 cards that can only do OpenGL 1.3. I just saw a bug report from someone like 2 days ago who was trying to run Blender on a Radeon 9000. Yeah. So, what can we do about that? Maybe we need to make some other mechanism so that you can have multiple available drivers and have applications say, I want a hardware one that supports a crappy GL version or a software one that supports the functionality I need. I don't know what the answer is there, but we should figure it out. So once we get things split out, I would really, really love to see GLX be deprecated. In addition to all of the pain that is indirect rendering, adding support for new GLX extensions is a giant hassle. The problem is that you have to add support for the extension in the client and the server. As the recent, or I guess a year ago now, ARB create context debacle shows, we've been shipping support for that extension in the client side part for a year, and September 5th we finally shipped the X server that supports it too. So we had gotten a bunch of bug reports from buggy applications that were just checking the list of extensions supported by the client library and said, oh yay, this extension's supported, and then it tries to send protocol to the server and they die in a fire. So we don't have that problem with EGL because it's entirely client side. We can just add support into EGL and be done with it. So getting people off of GLX will help us get new technology out to people much, much easier. To do that, we need to convince distros to ship EGL by default. I think that most of them have it, but that the libraries don't necessarily get installed because none of the applications that are part of the distro's desktop environment use it. Yeah?
We have brought EGL on clients on distros because Win started to optionally depend on that.
Okay.
So all distributions actually shipping KDE ship EGL.
Okay, great. So that's kind of the next step is getting. KDE is using EGL, so a lot of is optionally using.
So we started depending optionally on EGL something like 2 years ago, and we brought by that most distributions which actually ship Quinn to also ship EGL. So it's basically in most distros in the default install now.
Okay.
You can actually flip a switch and make it mandatory?
I would love to make it mandatory, but we have one little problem with that, and that are the proprietary drivers, where we not really get EGL. So,
Yeah, sorry for that. The, to be fair, we are shipping EGL on Tegra, and we're working on adding it to the big GPU NVIDIA driver. I can't speak for ATI, but yeah, so we're getting closer.
Okay, so so part of getting them to ship it is it's maybe a chicken and egg problem is getting desktop environments to use it and get off GLX. And certainly we don't want to add any more functionality to GLX unless we absolutely have to. Kind of related with that, we should also make OpenGL+ES part of the ABI. Bart had a really great talk about, why aren't people making apps for X? Well, I think the reason people aren't making apps for X is because they're busy making it for mobile platforms. And so by enabling the API that everyone uses on every single mobile platform, we can enable X as a development test bed for people making apps for those platforms, and then also enable them to be able to port applications from Android or iOS to X. As far as I know right now, Intel's the only one really supporting ES on the desktop. We can build other open source drivers for it, but I don't think that any of the folks working on those drivers do any testing on it. I believe that at least through the GLX extension, I think NVIDIA supports ES2.
Right, through the compatibility, or through the profile selection.
The GLEXT create context ES2 profile giant mouthful of an extension name thing.
Yeah. But the libraries aren't consistent. You get that from calling the right entry points in libgl rather than...
Right. And so splitting things up are kind of the enabling steps to doing this. So part of what's going to make this possible and allow this kind of the next step, I believe, is updating the interface, what we've traditionally referred to as the loader driver interface. So the way that in current implementations that either libgl or libegl talks to the client-side driver that it loads, or that the GLX module and the X server talks to the same driver binary to load that and route GL calls to it. The last step, I think, in this whole process is revamping that. There's some places in that where it's kind of, well, it's gotten moldy in there, and there have been a lot of pieces of duct tape applied. And so if we're going to kind of revamp things on the other side of that interface, we should go ahead and revamp that as well, and take the opportunity to have a flag day sort of thing. Just by being here, we have at least one closed source vendor showing interest in doing this, and I think that's what it's going to take to finally make it possible. But it's probably going to take some time to agree on how to do this and to sort out a bunch of issues. There's still some concerns about dispatch overhead, for example, on immediate mode, and things for certain types of applications that people generally don't try to run on the open source drivers because
you guys don't run ViewPerf?
Yes. Well, we run it, but don't care about it too much because it represents apps that no one tries to run on. Right?
OEMs don't make buying decisions for you based on ViewPerf.
Right. Yes, and consumers don't either. They want to know how fast does it run. Oh wait, there's no games on Linux, so we don't care. But that's changing too. So this will be the hardest step, and I think we'll kind of, really make Linux overall, or Linux and X overall, a more credible environment for OpenGL moving forward. So one kind of side thing about this is that if we actually do kill off indirect rendering and make it not required anymore, that will actually make a bunch of this easier, because then we don't have to worry about how the loader driver interface will work in the X server, because we won't care. Right? The only reason that that interface exists there is so that we can send GL commands through protocol to the X server and then have it dispatched to the driver. If you're not doing that anymore, you don't care. Okay, so kind of recapping, split up libgl now. Try to convince distros distros and desktop environment makers to start drinking the EGL Kool-Aid. To do this, we may need to try to produce some kind of GLX to EGL porting guide or some kind of additional documentation. I did a little bit of searching around, and there is really not very. There's documentation for using either API if you've never seen either one, but if you've been using one, there's nothing of, you know, how to easily go from one to the other.
I mean, for a lot, it's a sed script.
Yeah. For most of it, yeah. There are some differences. Differences about swap control and the context lost stuff, and some things like mostly things that exist in EGL that don't exist in GLX. And there's a couple. It seems like there's a couple maybe NVIDIA extensions that are only in GLX and not in EGL.
Yeah, there's like swap groups and a few things like that.
Right. So hey, you know, get those onto EGL, damn it. And then, you know, taking a bit more time to revamp the loader driver interface. We can certainly do these things in parallel, and this kind of longer term project really shouldn't block the other things. And we'll just, you know, do things kind of the open source way, where we'll gradually make changes until we rule the world or whatever. So Andy had put up a really nice proposal that he posted to the Mesa Dev mailing list. It's also on GitHub. If you're interested, check it out and comment on it. I think that we're going to have a lot of discussions over the next coming weeks and kind of refining things in it and working that towards the ideal. And kind of in the meantime, we'll probably start hacking up code and moving things around. My current expectation is that probably what we'll do is take a lot of code that's currently in Mesa and move it out to a separate repository so that we can have like the libopenGL and libglass and a bunch of those things live someplace else so that they're not tied to other projects. I suspect that may make it easier for some of the closed source vendors to be able to make contributions to that. Their corporate overlords may freak out if they're making contributions to Mesa. I don't know.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But yeah, in any case, you know, NVIDIA is very willing to help contribute and make make the API dispatching stuff happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was what I had. Any questions or comments?
So, Ian, for the libopenGL versioning thing, and yeah, if you can express the SO name in the link command line, that's cool. What's that? Okay. The for core profile versus compatibility profile.
Right. Yes, I had meant to mention that, and I forgot to mention that.
So, you know, NVIDIA is going to continue to provide all the old entry points. We've got enough legacy ISPs. We need to continue to do that. But is it interesting to carve that out into a separate library so you don't have to expose those entry points for...
Well, so just because the entry points are in the library doesn't mean that the driver has to support the functionality. So I think having just one library that provides everything...
It's easier.
Probably...
Yeah. Okay.
Eric likes it, and he's one of the people most strongly arguing for us to not do compatibility, so...
Yeah. Okay.
What about a case where you have a really old distribution, like maybe the previous Debian from a few years back, and then you try to run a new application that may want some new symbols? How is that compatibility working?
Well, so they would have to, the library that has those symbols would have to exist somewhere on that system, or that application would be screwed anyway.
So that application has, if it's a binary application, has to ship its own copy of the library.
I mean, any app, any binary app that has library dependencies has to somehow make sure that its dependencies are fulfilled, right? I mean, this.
Yeah, but not necessarily. If you have Wine, for example, just DL opens the GL library and it may want to use all the old versions or whatever is available in there for direct 3D9.
Well, then it can link against the older version of the library, right? So that was the thing about. So we'll make a new lib OpenGL each time there's a new version. And so if you only need OpenGL 3.0, then your application can link against the library that has just the 3.0 symbols. Right? Yep. If you need 3.2, you could link against that one.
But for the foreseeable future, there'll always be a libgl.sh.
Right. Yeah, that is, we won't be able to get rid of that, probably ever.
Okay.
And so then being able to just get proc address and do things the old way will continue to work. But for newer apps, they can do this and avoid some of those, jumping through some of those hoops.
Well, I'm saying that it might not always be the case because some apps might have OpenGL 3.0 fallback in case the new ones are not available.
Then they could DL. I mean, they could still use the DL open trick, right? And if you can't DL open the one that you wanted, then you could try DL opening a different one. I mean, we're kind of straying more and more into hypothetical, right? People tend to keep their distros up to date when they get new apps.
Not for Wine per se. Sometimes they want it done old ones.
Well,
you're very optimistic.
It sounds like a personal problem. I mean, well, and so it doesn't. I suppose if the library is split out in its own repository and it's kind of its own thing, there wouldn't be any reason that those apps couldn't ship their own libgl that provides the symbols. I don't know. It starts to stray off into some pretty sketchy territory. I don't know. I mean, and that's the thing is that really we're kind of bumping the ABI, right? The kind of the fundamental system requirement. And so if an app is coded to say, I need this, it's kind of like apps that require a 3.3 kernel. You can't run them on your 5-year-old distro that can't have that kernel.
So it's more a note on that you say, okay, people tend to upgrade, so that's not quite true. But for the
well, numerically. Right.
Shipping the old libgl for some time.
What well, I mean, realistically, we'll probably have to ship the old libgl forever. I mean, realistically, because there'll be some, apps that people are still gonna run Neverwinter Nights probably until the end of time, and they will need it for that. So.
Yeah, it seems like.
No, you can recompile that. Shut up, Chad.
Yeah, it seems like the new ABI option gives you a chance to have your components of your system that are integrated into your distro's environment and part of their build not have to jump through so many hoops to get libgl.
Right. Right.
One concern I have, though, is if we're providing a new lib OpenGL for every GL minor version, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, etc., how is this supposed to work when my GStreamer libraries are linking to 3.1 and my Cairo is linking to 3.0 and my application links to 4.n?
So I guess...
Do all these libraries inherit from each other? That's a giant mess in library.
Simple versioning is the zoning
Yeah, well, so I guess what you could do is since each one is.
Yeah, and also in my write-up, and I think there's a link from the page that Ian linked to. I did some examples with ELF symbol versioning, so that like the symbol that you link against actually gets stamped in the binary as coming from this particular libgl. So I think you could distinguish between you can ensure that you get the right symbol. It still seems complicated. It might be better if we don't have all those different libraries, but I think you could avoid the problem.
The single library that has all the
Yeah.
symbols available and it links to the requirements that actually need to be
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
It's called version symbols.
Yeah. Yeah. And on GitHub, I've got an example of how to do
So
that.
would we-
Loading multiple libgl libraries and getting the right
So then how does that, so the other problem that no one has brought up yet is dealing with another case where we already have difficulties where we have an app, say some app written using Waffle that at runtime wants to decide whether it's going to use GLES or desktop GL, where those are going to live in separate libraries then? Does that? Yeah.
Trying to do like cross-version trickery like that. If you're going to try and runtime detect and use an appropriate library as opposed to I know that my environment has OpenGL on the desktop, then you're going to be using DLOpen and DLSim, and I think that's something that you're accepting by signing up for cross API compatibility
Right.
like that.
Okay, I can buy that. I can buy that. I mean, we already have, I mean, we have to make it, right now we've jumped through some fairly painful hoops in Mesa to make it so that you can have an application that potentially uses both at the same time or that switches context back and forth by making sure that GL text image 2D can route through the same way through either API and get to the same place in the driver. So yeah, I can buy that we could just make that work with the same DL simming stuff, because I don't think there's going to be that many applications that try to do this runtime selection. I don't know.
So, in many other GL stacks, you just can't do this with other GL
Right.
stacks. So if apps rely on this, they're effectively Mesa specific.
Well, and so that's part of why we also are going to update the loader driver interface so that, you know, if it works with the open source drivers on Linux, it will also be able to work with the closed source drivers. And if if doing this kind of thing doesn't work on, what other platform has ES and desktop GL?
But it's,
Right?
it's not a feature worth preserving, really. It's a crazy hack that we should get rid of.
Okay.
My big concern is that if we, I mean,
Does this one work?
Yeah, sorry. It sounds like we're getting rid of indirect and replacing it with nothing, yeah? There's going to be no way to hose 3D over the wire now, or there is, and I don't know what it is.
VNC kind of send the pixels.
Yeah, you can send the pixels, but you're not going to be able, the
Right.
consensus of this room is
Well,
that,
and for practical purposes, you can't do it anyway, right? The only the most recent GL version that is supported is from 1999.
well, I've had students in the last few years who've written apps and run them that way and been really happy in certain hardware environments. I don't know. I mean,
There's people who are happy with a lot of things
Well,
that
I've
I
sat
would
there-
never do, that I would not recommend.
worked great. I've sat there and played their little game and watched it run, and it's, seemed to have fine performance. It seemed to be happy in a situation where they couldn't have run it because of hardware constraints any other way.
So, NVIDIA extended the GLX protocol, and they actively maintained that. So maybe
Right.
this guy can talk about that. But also I've mentioned previously for the security discussion that the application side rendering is so important. So really I'm looking at use cases where you have CFD computation or CFD simulation results which are 3D data cases, computational fluid dynamics data sets. They run on a cluster for say 2 or 3 weeks or something, and you do the computation somewhere over the ocean from Europe, and you do visualization on these, and just to be able to run the application in the United States. Put their image together and just send that resulting image to the client by the usual X protocol. That would be sufficient and would be even better than what we have now with indirect rendering. So if we could support that in the future, something like that, application side rendering, where you have on the cluster where your data resides, you have possibly multiple terabytes of data where you extract something that you can put on the GPU. Render that in the application and do that.
And there's a whole bunch of different ways available today that you can do that, right? That you can do the rendering on your compute cluster and ship pixels over the wire.
So maybe we should make some helper library. Christian's got Wayland things to say, I'm sure, but
yeah.
So I guess in the intermediate in X, maybe we can build some helper library, a client-side thing that does read pixels or something and builds images to ship across the wire. On the topic of GLX and NVIDIA's implementation, I'm kind of a masochist. I think GLX protocol is cool, but in a 1990s sort of way.
In a look ma, no hands kind of thing. Yeah. So I used to be the same way until pretty recently, and then I rage quit.
Yeah, I mean, NVIDIA is still doing work to continue to update GLX protocol. We're definitely way behind the current state of the art for OpenGL.
Yeah, I think the last stuff I saw coming from folks your side was to add some bits for OpenGL 2.0, 2.0 and 2.1.
Yeah, so it's dated.
Yeah.
Quick comment. I am completely in favor of doing the simple version in Think that we just discussed. Before we jump on that bandwagon, I just want us to, I really like Clang. I want to investigate how well this is supported with the Clang leaker, Gold, just before jumping on this bandwagon.
Yeah, I think that
it's
there's,
the right way to go.
before we decide exactly what to do, there's a bunch of experiments that we should do to see how well a bunch of these things work, and probably solicit feedback from people making applications, right? Talk to folks like Valve and stuff. They're trying to bring big OpenGL code bases to Linux and see if this stuff actually, if the ideas that we have actually meet their needs.
Of course.
So, yeah, there's still need for a lot more discussion and a lot more collecting of data.
So back to indirect rendering. Right now, when you are rendering over the network, our library, libgl goes and looks and determines whether it's running over the network, I think, or maybe it asks the driver, the DRI protocol first.
Yeah.
And then we decide to fall back to indirect rendering. We could, in our loader, say, oh, look, I'm going over the wire. Let me open my native driver like normal, or my native SWRAS driver like normal, and I'll just shove images over the wire through put image. We could do this without the application having any knowledge of what happened to it, other than some read pixels happens.
Ooh, I like that.
That's what I think of.
You need the DRM tool that we just talked about for that stuff, because you don't have anyone to authenticate you on that local machine. So you need to be able to say start rendering without having a master that authenticates you. But it ties. Yeah, it ties in nicely with that work. But it's, I'm just pointing out that's a dependency.
Well, and so something that Apple has is they have a concept of having multiple, I don't remember what they call it. I think they call it renderers, where on a particular screen you have sort of N OpenGL devices that are implementations that you can pick from, and each one has potentially different capabilities. So applications could enumerate that and pick a different one. That was kind of what I was alluding to before about for the case of like R200, we could have the hardware driver and your app could say, oh, this supports everything I need and it says it's hardware, so it's probably faster. I'll pick that. Otherwise, I'll pick the software one that is slower but has the functionality I actually need. And so this may be able to fit in with that.
Maybe it's possible to put that into something, choose context function and add some attributes for a minimum OpenGL version, or accept software rendering, or accept client-side rendering, or something.
Right. Yeah. So the put image, that would just be like a new backend thing of or a loader side implementation of swap image.
Sure.
Wow.
It's just what OpenGL does.
Okay, that's cool. I like that. I'll expect to see some patches tonight.
So Ian, an entirely different question. So you commented earlier about GLX plus GLES. So I think even if we split the things out into separate libraries, we wouldn't get that for free. The GLX make current is talking about big OpenGL, and I guess maybe through the profile mechanism.
Yeah, you still have the profile mechanism, so you could still create the context and make it current. And
okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I was going to ask if GLX plus GLS was a compelling use case if we have EGL, but I'll leave that alone.
Yeah. So and there's some debate about that, and that's why the extension to create ES contexts in GLX is just an EXT and not an ARB extension, because no one was really that excited about it. So it was like, okay, we can do this.
Yeah.
And so I had enabled it in our implementation because it was basically free. Yeah. I just had to make the string available.
Yeah. I don't think it was a whole lot much more for us. Yeah.
Yeah.
So another comment. I think. I mean, one of the things I'm really excited about with this dispatching idea is to no longer have the libgl.so fight, or installation time fight.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess one of the goals for me is to be able to provide an NVIDIA driver implementation that a user can install on any distro with that would have the front end piece. I'd like to be able to provide that user new OpenGL new OpenGL versions without. I guess I'm not sure how that user would get a new enough libopenGL to expose those entry points.
So
I guess
so for the libopen. So what we'd have to do is so you're wondering about the case where they have a libopenGL that only supports
like 4.1
and they want to do 4.4.
Yeah.
Right. So in that case, I mean, if they're trying to run an application that actually is linked with the 4.4, they would have to get it somehow.
Right.
If they're running on an application that's only requires 4.1, so it's linked with that library, but it can use additional functionality, it could just use the get proc address stuff that it uses now for any functions that are above and beyond what's in there. And from over the last couple of versions, we haven't really added that many new functions to OpenGL. It's mostly been more shading language stuff and a bunch of things like that. So
that's a good point.
I think there's a bunch of apps that wouldn't really need any extra functions. They would just, oh, look, I can do more stuff with my shaders or different types of shaders or whatever.
A potential problem would be if the app developer linked against OpenGL 4.4 because that's what he had.
What was there.
And then the user only has 4.1, and what I want to avoid is to get back and then someone's tempted to, outside of their distro, install a new libopenGL 4.4 to then we're back into the install fights again. So as long as we avoid that sort of problem.
Yeah.
So we don't have to solve it now, but it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, and it seems doable, and then so that was one of the reasons why I was thinking we would have an actual separate library for the different versions, because then if that user, if they're on a particular distro version that is only doing the 4.1 libopenGL, and that user plunks down a 4.4 libopenGL, well, the distro's never even going to notice, right? Because it's
that's
right.
That's true too.
So,
I guess other than potentially the libOpenGL.so symlink pointing at
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
But if they're explicitly linking against a particular SO name, they don't actually
Right.
need the libOpenGL.so symlink.
Or they could, you know, if people happen to be in that situation, they could just put that other library like in the application directory and use like LD library path stuff to make it work.
Yeah.
Or there's, I think there's some solutions that people could use to work around this kind of hypothetical case.
Yeah.
But we will need to keep that in mind and try and kind of prevent it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Now we are pretty